evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this Humanities seminar, Women and the Work of Democracy, Politics, Power, and Public Life for Women Across History. My name is Pamela Sweat, and I'm Dean of the Faculty of Humanities. Along with my duties as Dean, I'm also an historian specializing in the social and cultural history of modern Europe, especially Germany in the early half of the 20th century. In the Faculty of Humanities, we explore human culture in many different ways. Our faculty, staff, and students can be found in art studios, in experimental laboratories, in archives and libraries, and out in the community, engaged in a variety of community-based activities. We have around 100 full-time faculty in a number of different disciplines, from music cognition to English and cultural studies, French to communication management, many more. At McMaster, we believe that the humanities has a critical role to play in understanding ourselves and the wider world, and in confronting the major challenges that we face today. We also believe in lifelong learning and the importance of strengthening the relationship between the campus and our neighbors, near and far. And that's why we're here tonight, to hold events that will bring together our wonderful researchers with our community partners and alumni. And we're so pleased that you could join us for this discussion. So let's get started. I'm going to begin just by introducing our two wonderful researcher colleagues that we have tonight. First, Allauren Forbes. Allauren is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy. She's also a faculty member in Gender and Social Justice. Her primary field of research lies at the intersection of early modern European philosophy and feminist philosophy. Her work is especially concerned with the ways women and other marginalized philosophers of this period conceived projects of mutual transformation, solidarity, and resistance to oppression across both epistemic and socio-political domains. Her research focuses on relations such as custom, marriage, and education, and examines how these function simultaneously as sites of domination and resistance. Our other guest is Dr. Lara Campbell. Lara is a professor in our history department and the L.R. Wilson Research Chair in Leadership and Civic Engagement. Her research focuses on Canadian women's and gender history, social movements, the welfare state, and feminist theory. Her work examines how gender, family, citizenship, and political activism have shaped struggles for social justice and democratic participation in Canada, particularly in the 20th century. She's especially interested in the intersections of feminist, anti-war, and labor activism, and in the ways collective action has challenged structures of inequality across social and political domains. I'm going to start by inviting each of our guests to provide a bit more information about their work. So, Allauren, why don't you give us a start?
Great. Thank you so much. So I like to describe the kind of research that I do as being the history of feminism, which is to say, maybe the word feminism is a relatively recent invention, but it turns out that women and patriarchy are not. So lots of women working in the 16th through 18th century had a lot to say about the kind of conditions they're in. So that's the kind of thing I like to think about. But I also teach in contemporary feminist philosophy. So last semester, I taught a bunch of classes about love, relationship ethics, philosophy of love and sex, love and monsters. Pretty important relation. Yeah. Happy to be here.
Thank you. And Lara?
Well, thank you. Well, much of what I'll be speaking to this evening emerges from my last book, which was A History of Women's Right to Vote in British Columbia. And this was really part of a national project that was rethinking the history of women and political equality across the country. So I'm really happy to talk about the importance of region in Canadian history, if anybody wants to talk about that. As Pamela mentioned, I have another project on the Vietnam War and how it played out in Canada, sort of looking at the intersection of multiple social movements, so the early feminist movement, the anti-war movement, and the women's peace movement. And then these have led off into side projects on the history of second wave feminism and how that intersects with the history of emotions, particularly emotions of joy and anger, as well as a little small collaborative project on the history of socialist feminism at the turn of the century. So thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and I want to, on behalf of the faculty, thank you both for joining us tonight. I know we're in the middle of semester, so everybody's busy, but we really appreciate it. So as we enter into the main part of the seminar, I want to invite all of our listeners to, if they've got a question for either of the panelists, please feel free to enter it in the Q&A at any time during our conversation tonight, and we'll try to get to some of these questions toward the end of the conversation. So let's dive right in, and we're going to start with Allauren. Allauren, so your research, as you were just explaining, looks at women philosophers from the early modern period who were thinking seriously about things like marriage, friendship, and social customs. What kinds of life experiences drew them to sort of ponder these big questions? What kinds of questions were they asking about women's power and agency? And for those of us who aren't philosophers, how might we understand or apply their ideas today?
So philosophy has this reputation of being, something that people only do in like ivory towers, like it's totally divorced from what it is to be a human being in this
Mhm,
world. But
mhm,
as these women have said at great length for hundreds of years, it turns out that philosophy is a really helpful tool for helping us understand the conditions of our own lives. So they were trying to theorize about real experiences that they had. The fact that for many of them, they were just expected to get married, and that was, considered a profession for women. And this was not something you choose. It's not necessarily a match for love, but something that you have to do. And so they're trying to think through the ways in which that makes them more or less free and what it cuts off as possibilities for the kinds of lives that they could lead. Sometimes they're talking about like difficult personal experiences and trying to theorize how that works. So Marie de Gournay, for example, in the 16th century, uh, has this opening of one of her papers that talks about this experience where she's trying to talk to a man and she's saying something very clever and he can tell that he's not going to win this argument, and so with a mere smile and a nod he indicates to the rest of the company it's only a woman speaking.
mhm,
And everyone else is like, yeah, women, am I right? They can't do philosophy, they can't do this.
mhm,
And she theorizes this experience as a way in which her credibility, the fact of her being a knower and being seen as a knower, is rendered impossible in this kind
mhm,
of social and political environment. So much of it is philosophical in the way that we think about that now, but very personal in the sense
mhm.
of like this is very much like the stakes of their lives. So a lot of it is deeply personal in a way that maybe philosophers aren't famous for thinking about now.
Yeah.
Um, but most of the questions that they were thinking about or are thinking about the nature of the kinds of constraints that their lives are rendered under.
Mm,
So are these constraints external with respect to like policies or laws or social customs? Or are some of these constraints perhaps internal? So in this time period, there is this large debate, the Querelle des Femmes, the woman question or woman debate about the nature and status of women and whether they were like to men or whether they were fundamentally different, which is to say, like worse.
mm,
And so that's the background in which all this is happening. They're trying to think through, well, are we in fact flawed because of some feature of our nature as designed by God or just the metaphysical facts of who and what we are? Or is this deficit, if there is one, acquired rather than natural?
mm,
And how are we going to test this if it is in fact different from, some fundamental truth of who and what we are? So they're asking questions about the nature of this constraint, and they're asking questions about how we recognize the ways in which they have been constrained, because sometimes it's tricky. So some of them were very good about flagging the fact that we can be sort of manipulated and think that some things are natural when in fact they are human custom.
mhm,
But with enough time and enough, collective agreement, we all just assume that these are features of human nature or women's nature rather than, quirks of history or culture. Um, so one example of this is wooing or courtship, as we might think about it. Some of them, Marie Estelle, Marie de Gournay, Margaret Cavendish, flag ways in which this practice, it seems like men are prostrating themselves before women, making a big show of how, the women are going to have a really good good time afterwards. They're going to be, queens and treated very, very well. But in fact, afterwards, that's not the conditions of what marriage is like for the average woman in the 17th century. And they're being willfully misled so that they are making decisions that they can't really appreciate the gravity of. So that's tricky, seeing through these things. How we can apply this today. So I think there's two sort of important lessons that they would want us to take away. And the funny thing, I suppose, for us is that perhaps we would expect there to be much bigger differences between people talking about stuff like 300, 400 years ago and now. But unfortunately, much of what they were discussing is directly relevant to today. It's more like a difference in degree rather than in kind. But so the two takeaways, I guess, would be having communities. We need to find people and groups with whom we can find solidarity and support. So Mary Estelle was trying to sell people on a women's educational institution, something like a women's college, which was especially notable because in the 17th century, women weren't allowed to go to school at all. Like there was no formal education for girls or women. So we need to find our people and work together with them to engage in, mutual transformation. And the second thing is that we need to figure out what the tools are that are being used to oppress us and co-opting them or co-opt them for our own emancipation. So Madeleine de Scudéry, as a French philosopher, has this really wonderful work called Illustrious Women. And in this work, it's a bunch of speeches from historical and perhaps fictional women in a moment of crisis, in a moment where their lives are at stake or their legacies or their futures. And they are giving these impassioned speeches. And what it looks like on the surface is just sort of an interesting quirk. But in the context in which people would be reading and receiving this kind of work, it's a work of rhetoric that is deliberately designed to help women make persuasive cases when they're dealing with the real effects of patriarchy in their lives, when situations of enormous oppression are bearing down on them, like teaching them the means by which to negotiate these systems. So it might look different now, but same thing in principle.
Yeah. And I can see, I'm sure your students certainly see the questions that they have as young women, right? I mean, this isn't, as you said, right? It's surprising how maybe how little has changed, at least in terms of how the big questions that we're still asking as women. Okay, so thank you so much. Lara, when people think about women's suffrage, it's often told as a simple story of women finally winning the vote. What have you found through your research gets left out when we look at that story? And what might surprise us about the time immediately following women earning the right to vote?
This is such a great question because I feel like I could fill hours of time about, which I won't do, about what's been left out of the story of suffrage or women attempting to win the right to vote in Canada. I think there's often a tendency to simplify that story, to find the one time that you win the one right. And that just flattens a huge level of complexity in Canada, particularly when you have a constitutional system like what we have in Canada, where provinces have a lot of power to define who gets to vote and who does not. So I came to sort of see the story of suffrage as a story about these webs of intersecting restrictions. So gender is one of those restrictions, and it's a long-lasting restriction, but so too were restrictions of race and of region, of religion, property status, residency status. The list really goes on. And of course, what kind of vote you want. So you have municipal, provincial, and federal, but you also have school board elections. And the fight really is multi-tiered and happens at all those levels and looks really different across the whole country, which I think is why a regional approach is really important. And I think this is kind of connecting to what Allauren was saying as well. I think that the perception and the stereotype of suffrage women in particular is that in Canada that they were very polite, they didn't like to argue, that they were willing to sort of stand back and politely ask. But actually, they had to get really creative and they knew that they had to convince male politicians and they knew that they had to convince the male voting public. So they were looking to persuade people to the cause. And they really faced, at least in British Columbia, they faced anti-suffrage men head on. They weren't polite at all. They staged public debates. They invited anti-suffrage men to debate them, and they actually debated whether or not to undertake some direct action, like of the kind that the suffragettes were undertaking in Great Britain. They did not go down that route, but they had open debates about it. And so those, I think, are the stories that have been left out. And I think in terms of the surprise, I had to think about that one. But I think my surprise is not that surprising. But I think the surprise was that suffrage women, at least in British Columbia, when they achieved the right to vote, and not all women achieved the right to vote, but the majority of white settler women achieved the right to vote, they believed that this would translate into electoral success, that they could achieve the right to run for office and they would win. And this is particularly true in British Columbia because it was the only province in Canada that actually held a public referendum, a binding referendum on women's voting rights, in which, of course, only men could vote. And they won that referendum with about 70% of the male voting public. And they actually thought that that would translate into success at the polls. But it didn't, and they were surprised. And really, it takes much more political politics and solidarity building at the local level, as well as the emergence of the CCF, so a social democratic party, to really help women move into electoral success.
Okay. Terrific. So now we'll come back to Allauren with a question about politics. And, as Lara was just explaining, the focus is usually just on, sort of voting, holding office, these sorts of very sort of formal politics. But based on your research, how do everyday experiences in women's lives, like relationships, social expectations, some of the things we've already, referenced, or even being listened to, shape how women understand their own power, both in the past and today?
So this is such a great question. The personal is political, as they say, and that's just like so fundamentally true. So I think the most important, I mean, there's many ways, but some of the most important ways are in terms of the way that our imagination works, and also some of the like concrete capacities that we have. So I have two examples. One is directly related to what Lara was just talking about, with no coordination on our part at all, so that's great. But about stories, and the other is about friendships. So stories are interesting because we end up with these like reinforcing cycles of evidence. So this is something that these women in like the 18th, 17th, 18th centuries were really concerned with, that we tell these stories about like women's nature being defective on a fundamental level. And the more that people talk about this, the more evidence there is that people think that this is the case, that yes, women really are defective. And the more that we prevent women from participating in other kinds of institutions, well, there are no women scholars. Yeah, because there's no women in schools.
Right. Yep.
There's no women doing this. There's no women doing that. Of course, maybe women just can't, or else they would, right? But these stories, they're treated like they're natural facts, or they're treated like they had to be the case. But the thing about stories is that people write them. People make editorial decisions. And so like cultural norms or stories end up setting these expectations that coordinate action. And most importantly to me, they shape what we can imagine. So a lot of these women, Gournay, Estelle, Cavendish, a bunch of other folks, they were all trying to expand our collective imaginations. So we're trying to make them more flexible. And sometimes they did that through like formal arguments, and sometimes they did it through telling literal stories. So writing novels, doing plays. But all of this is because they acknowledged that what we can imagine shapes what we can do. It shapes the way that we exercise our freedom, the kind of self-determination practices that we engage in. And so they tell different stories. So like Gournay begins a bunch of her works with like, here, actually, there are all these women in history doing stuff. We just don't talk about it. And here's all the evidence, bringing receipts, as one might say. Or Gabrielle Souchon argued for like creating a different kind of life. Like we tell this story that there's only two options for women. You get married and you become a wife and mother, or you go into the convent and you're married to God. And that's a very different kind of life. That's it, two institutional commitments. And she wanted a third way, which she called the celibate life, which is to say a life without institutional commitments. So her life that she ultimately forged for herself, working as a teacher, would qualify. And she wants us to imagine like differently. So what kinds of stories do we tell shape what we can imagine, what we think is possible or good. And so we just have to tell different stories. We have to collectively imagine a third option for all sorts of folks, women and other marginalized people. So the other part, the friendship part, I think friendship is like central to women's power in a bunch of ways, both how they exercise it and how they experience it or imagine themselves to have it. So on a practical level, friendships make us more capable. So like Souchon's celibate life required friendships. Having people in your corner allows you to take on like practical risks that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. Estelle was able to not marry and publish philosophy because she had rich lady friends who were her patrons, like, which, wouldn't mind a patron myself. Feel free to hit me up. Kidding. But anyway, friendships make us like morally and intellectually better too. So friends help us, like they call us on our nonsense. Estelle talks about friends helping us become virtuous. Or Scudery talks about friends helping us know ourselves because we're just too close. We can't know ourselves the way that other people can know us. And so we need other people to help us be the best versions of ourselves. But friendships itself, they help us imagine a better world and also make us want to take the steps to actually attain this. Maybe I'm okay with living a crummy life, but I'm not going to let my friend have a crummy life. And so maybe I'll take action for her that I wouldn't be able to or feel brave enough to do for myself.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to say something about confidence in there, right? The friends give you confidence to write that story, to live that life, right? Or to seek it for others. So that's terrific. And I think it connects really well to my next question for Lara. So, your work shows that women have been politically active in lots of ways beyond voting. Especially through collective action, like we were just describing. And that can come in lots of different forms, in your case, and through your work, protests, organizing, et cetera. So why is it important to recognize these forms of participation beyond voting? And what do they help us see about political change that voting alone might miss?
Well, thank you. It's a complicated question, I think, and it's such a good one. So when I was thinking about it, I had two answers. And I think the first part is that politically active women, and whether we're talking about suffragists in 1910 or radical feminists in 1969, were actually quite suspicious of traditional political parties. They really felt that the promises that political leaders made around questions of equality could be revoked quite easily. And so one thing I discovered, I went into my research with the assumption that the suffrage movement, which is traditionally conceived of as the fight to get the right to vote, was actually not completely about the right to vote. Suffragists rarely believed that voting alone would lead to social and political change of the kind that they wanted to see. Of course, there were always a few women who thought that that was enough. But for the most part, they really viewed the vote as a kind of a way to leverage political power to get the other kinds of changes that they hope to achieve. And that might be legal reforms. Women did not have guardianship rights to their children, for example, until the 1920s in most places in Canada. Equal pay reforms, minimum wages for working women. So there's a whole host of things. And I think that this ambivalence, and this maybe speaks a little bit to what Allauren was talking about, this ambivalence around conventional politics is why feminists over the century, over the 20th century, spent so much time working together, developing alliances, and building alternative structures that imagine activism, and political engagement in really broad ways. And I think that that last piece is really important when you take seriously the racial restrictions on voting in Canada. So most provinces have racial restrictions on voting until the late 40s and early 1950s. Federally, First Nations people cannot vote until 1960. So you really, as a historian, you really need to look more broadly for political engagement at the community level. You look at Black civil rights organizations and the lobbying they did in the 1950s to remove racial restrictions on professional education, for example. Or in the case of one of my interests, my research interests, the mid-century women's peace movement. They were hoping there weren't a lot of women at the federal level holding office at the federal level. And so they wanted to leverage their maternal love for their children and their families to pressure male-led governments across the world to eliminate nuclear weapons, because from their point of view, their children and the future of humanity, the human family, was at stake. So I think broadly speaking, it's not that women activists didn't think political power was important, but more that political organizing offered a wide range of opportunities to agitate for deeper levels of systemic change, if that makes sense.
Yep. Oh, no, definitely. For sure. Okay, so I think my next question, I'll open it up to both of you. Maybe Allauren can take the first stab at it. And it's around sort of methodology. So the methodologies you both discuss demonstrate, pretty creative ways to mobilize around political demonstrations, political demands. Are there current examples that you could point to where similar sorts of strategies, methods are being used? Allauren, you want to give that a try first?
Sure. So I think this question is tricky. So because a lot of the methodologies that the people I think about we're doing are still being used now, but pointing to specific folks that are doing it is tricky. So I guess I'll start with the abstract and then maybe give an example.
Sure.
So one of the people that I love the most in this period is Margaret Cavendish, who was a 17th century philosopher, wrote plays and poetry in addition to the more standard philosophical treatise. And in a lot of her plays, what she does is she inverts the sort of hierarchical power structures and makes the people who are the powerful in real life seem kind of absurd and laughable, and maybe not literally the butt of the jokes, but you can see the absurdity in a way that reveals something true about our world and not just the fictional world that she's created. And I think there are people doing this. Like, I think laughing at power is a really important tool to get people on board, to get them to feel in the right kinds of ways, and therefore to be inclined to find community and engage in collective action. It's like here in Canada, maybe like this hour is 22 minutes. Like laughing at power and political structures is good and important. Maybe the recent musical, I think it's called Six, about Henry VIII's six wives. I think that's another good example of like trying to turn the dynamics that we're familiar with on their head in an entertaining way. Because laughter is not just the best medicine, it's also a good way to hold power to account. And so I guess those would be the examples. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And, I was even thinking also of just, some of the kind of satirical so maybe not sort of laughing at formal, political structures and political power, but even some of the sort of satirical things I see online, even kind of challenging or undermining, sort of common tropes right now about what women should aspire to, some of the sort of teasing about the influencer culture and that sort of thing, right? So even there, it's a different storytelling that allows people to, to maybe, yeah, challenge those mainstream beliefs. Anyway, I'm sorry. That was not my question, wasn't posed to me, so I should stop talking. Lara, yeah, you're up.
Um, yeah, this was a great question. I think when I'm trying to link sort of the past and the present, I was thinking about what do people use that they have around them? What are the available tools or resources, technology? What do they have that they can use? Because if you're trying to persuade or convince people to a point of view, you generally want to use all the tools at your disposal. So it could be creative writing, plays, street theater, very common in both first and second wave feminism. Soapboxing, was very common in Vancouver. People would labor feminists would get up on a wooden crate and start challenging the crowd. It sometimes ended in pushing and shoving. One woman got knocked off her box and she got back up and kept going. So that willingness to engage and use the tools at your disposal. Also, a lot of satire. So one of the most important tools, I think, in both first and second wave feminism, is creating your own print culture, because you can't rely on the mainstream press to cover women in the way you might want to be covered. And so in the first wave of feminism in Canada, there's one suffrage periodical. It's published in Victoria, British Columbia. It's called The Champion. It ran for a couple of years and ran on volunteer labor, which is not dissimilar to the second wave feminist movement either. And it had political satire. It mocked anti-suffrage men. The other big tactic that was quite popular in the suffrage movement were mock parliaments. So if you've seen the Heritage Minutes, you know that it's the form of a play that takes on local shape. So where the women are the legislators and the men are begging for the right to vote, and they just subvert the arguments that are used against women voting. You're too emotional, you're irrational, and they turn that on men. But then they adapt it to the local environment. So they're making fun of local anti-suffrage politicians, and they're also having a laugh, and they're also fundraising. So they're using all those tools at their disposal. And I think we see that happening in this moment. The tool changes, but the goal of education and public awareness remains the same. I do wonder, though, and I was thinking about this, and I wonder what people think, because disinformation is so rampant because of the emergence of AI. That's changed the way we talk to each other. It's changed the way we communicate. And I think being more imaginative and creative about communication with each other will change the way we do politics in the future. But I don't know what that will look like.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and now I'm going to take us into the future with my next question. Actually, maybe before I deliver this question, I should just remind folks that we will shortly be moving into some questions from our listeners. So if you're out there and you want to contribute something, please put it in the Q&A there's a Q&A button on your screen, and we'd be happy to share that with Dr. Forbes and Dr. Campbell. Okay, so we were talking about the future. Lara, you sort of were starting to imagine what that might look like. So now I'm going to get you to do some more imagining about that future. So let's say 200 years from now, both of you, what will researchers say, do you think, about women from the 21st century and their involvement in the political sphere and activism more generally? And another way of putting it, what do you hope is remembered about this time in history? Maybe we'll start again with you, Allauren.
Sorry, I did the thing in Zoom where you don't. Oh my gosh, rookie move. Sorry. Okay.
Don't worry, we're still here.
Okay. So the future is something I feel woefully unqualified to speak on because I spent so much time in like the 17th century. I'm like uniquely bad at this. Okay, what I think people are gonna say, I think they're gonna say there's a bit of a like mixed bag about what's happening in the world right now, which is to say some women are working real hard at making the world better for all of us, and some women are working real hard at reinscribing very traditional power structures. So like the trad wife phenomenon, for example, is I think a really interesting and paradoxical example of this, as you mentioned earlier, about like influencer culture.
Sure.
It's kind of like Phyllis Schlafly, like women working so hard at like making a career for themselves, but also pulling the ladder up after them. But what I think that means is that that's kind of still a victory for feminism. You know, if you can make a career as a woman doing anti-feminist stuff, like feminism made that possible.
Right,
So
true,
that's
true.
great. We're going to take that as a win. So I think they'll say it's like a pluralistic time, which is good. That pluralism is good. And what I hope they say, and this is going to be so corny, so I am so sorry, but I hope that they're going to say that like we looked to the past and we saw the kinds of advances that people made and also the mistakes that they made, and we've reckoned with that. And having reckoned with that, we have collectively worked together to establish something bigger and better for the future, because any kind of lasting change requires big like collective action, and we have to all sort of get together and act in solidarity. So I don't know what that looks like specifically, but that's what I hope people say about us sometime in the future.
Sounds good to me. Lara?
That's such a great answer. I don't know if I can top it. Um, well, I mean, I think sometimes when you look at media narratives around feminist political engagement around this time, the late 20th and early 21st century, is that it's a period of divisiveness, and I hope that we remember this period as a time when women were actually willing to disagree, um, not just in opposition to people who were oppressing them, but disagree with each other about why this oppression exists, where it comes from, and what we can do about it. Um, and I do hope. I hope that this is a period that's remembered as a time when we're more willing to talk openly about the high cost of exclusionary politics. I think that wasn't faced head on, particularly exclusions of race. And then maybe just picking up on what Allauren said, one thing that really struck me when I do research on both first and second wave feminism is the importance of friendship and solidarity, that women build networks together by joining together, sometimes in small groups, and then making those small groups bigger and then attaching themselves to larger movements. But it's the intimacy of those friendships that actually keep them moving forward, even in times when it doesn't look like you're going to win what you want to win. And so I hope that this is a moment. I hope that that's remembered about feminist activism at this time, but I hope we remember that going forward as well.
Right. Yeah, and let me just pick up on that with one of the questions that's come in from our listeners, and that's around allyship. So, Allauren, maybe you can, thinking about your own work and the philosophers, the female philosophers that you've worked on. Did any male philosophers kind of, really listen to them and validate their arguments and, come to support them?
Absolutely. So some of the women that we have access to, like the works that they published, are only possible because there were sort of powerful now canonical men philosophers who took them seriously. And it was the fact of those men taking them seriously that got them enough credibility to sort of make it into the history books as we now have access to them. So, male allyship is really important because pluralism is important, because, we require solidarity to make real change, but also because those of us who have, hierarchical power of various kinds, we can choose to use that to make the world better and to support those who might not have the same kind of institutional support that we do. So, like Rene Descartes, for example, one of the most famous philosophers, perhaps of all, he was good friends with at least two women philosophers. So Queen Christina of Sweden, who employed him as a private tutor, and he died, he died on the way to visit her, one of the many times that he visited her. And Elizabeth of Bohemia, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, and him, they had a very close friendship for many years. And the correspondence they produced was like philosophically interesting in its own right, but also was the reason that he went on to publish The Passions of the Soul. So he was helpful to Elizabeth, and she was helpful to him, because philosophy is in fact a team sport, no matter what people might say.
Right. Yeah, and a similar question for Lara is going to sort of be two parts. I'm curious about the one, the question that I just asked Lara that came from the audience around, male support maybe of the women who were mobilizing for the vote, but also the flip, sort of the other side of the coin. I'm curious if you could maybe tell us a little bit, thinking about your work around, anti-Vietnam protests. And we often think of the men who were at the forefront of that fight, and I'm curious about the women who maybe have supported them.
Well, yeah, in the suffrage movement, there was support from male allies, and in fact, suffragists really relied on them to place bills in front of the legislature, read them out. And they lost most of them, but it was really important that you had someone willing to stand up and bring that to a vote. And in BC, actually, they got very close to winning one of those votes. I think it was in 1898. One of the MLAs actually put his hand up at the wrong time and voted for the wrong side, and so it was essentially a tied vote that was broken by the anti-suffrage speaker. So that was a tough one, but those alliances were really important. Yeah, the anti-Vietnam activists are really interesting, because when we think of draft resistance during the Vietnam War, and we think of the draft resistance movement and as it plays out in Canada, we often think of men. And of course, American men are subject to the draft, and women were not. But there are two answers to that question. American women play a really important role in convincing men to come to Canada, is sometimes as wives or girlfriends of men whose draft number is potentially about to come up. Sometimes, and I've seen this in letters, women whose sons were in their early teens, but they couldn't imagine the war ending, right? What they saw was escalation of war, and they didn't want their sons to be drafted. So they worked really hard to convince their husbands to preemptively move to Canada in case the war didn't end. And then in Canada, women played a really critical role in support work for draft resistors, because a lot of men turned up and didn't know how to look for a job. They didn't understand how the system in Canada worked. They didn't know where to live. And so it's women, particularly women who were involved in the peace movement. Quaker women played a really important role in that support movement. And they do a lot of job counseling and immigration counseling for men. And they work behind the scenes, so they don't often get remembered. And yet their support is really the backbone for that movement in the 60s and into the early 1970s.
Great. Okay, I've got another question for you. We've been talking about how the two eras, the two pasts that you've studied might influence our thinking about what's going on today or shape what's going on today. But one of our keen listeners has asked about the past of the past that you've studied. So here's the question. The point about the past is being well received. Who did the suffragettes and female philosophers look to for guidance? Who was their past? Allauren, do you want to try that one first?
That's a really good question.
Mhm.
So it depends on who you ask. So some of them, so like Mary Estelle, for example, is pointing to cases from the Bible, actually. So Old Testament and New Testament, cases where women had like divine power or were taken seriously by various kinds of religious figures in the Bible. And she uses this to show, like, look, maybe what's happening is people are cherry picking evidence and saying certain things about all women when it turns out that actually God and his representatives thought that, like, actually that's not necessary. We can in fact take women seriously. They can in fact have these important roles. So she points to that. But other women philosophers sometimes don't do that. So Margaret Cavendish, for example, describes herself as like Margaret the First, first of her name. Like she seems to think that she came out of nowhere. So
That's amazing.
it's funny, but
Mhm.
not scholarly, perhaps.
Mhm, mhm. But again, it comes back to that confidence issue, right?
So
Uh,
very, very.
Lara?
Well, interestingly, a lot of the suffragists actually looked to Joan of Arc.
Mhm.
They were really fascinated by the idea of a female martyr.
Mhm.
And so in Britain, when Emily Davison stands in front of, that image of her at the horse races, and she stands in front of the horse and the horse tramples her and she dies, they see her as a martyr and they link her willingness to sacrifice the female body
Mhm.
for a larger cause to that the image of Joan of Arc sort of in her armor and
Mhm.
fighting for something larger. So
Mhm.
that's the past that they're looking to,
Mhm.
and then it becomes a full circle kind of moment where feminist activists in the 60s and 70s often looked back to suffrage leaders in Canada to look at them as trailblazers for political equality.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Um, I want to we've only got 10 minutes or so, and I want to get back to a question or an issue that you brought up, Lara, thinking about the work you've done. You mentioned regional differences and that, looking at regions is important and trying to kind of parse out those differences. And I've noticed in, Allauren's responses, she'll often, she's mentioned some French philosophers, Swedish philosophers, English philosophers. So, are there differences? So maybe we'll start with Lara because you were the one who first raised it, this issue of sort of regional differences. But I'm also curious to learn if Allauren sees any kinds of sort of regional differences in the women that she studies. So, Lara, sorry.
Yeah, I think regional differences are important in the suffrage movement. Really, British Columbia is the only province that has, and it's actually Vancouver, really, is the only city that has an independent, separate working class suffrage movement.
Mm,
Which is not to say that working class women weren't involved in suffrage all over the country, because they were. But it's only in Vancouver that they create their own organization. And that organization is very rare, and I think it's the result of the political economy of British Columbia, the power that labor politicians and socialist politicians had at the political table, and so the voice of working class women in Vancouver is particularly strong.
mhm, mhm,
And then if we wanted to think about regionalism at a later time too, I think in terms of the anti-war and anti-draft movement, Toronto plays a really key role.
mhm,
But it plays a really interesting role after the Vietnam War ends, when the question of political amnesty comes to the table. And so men who had come to Canada actually want to go back to the United States, but they can't because they've committed a crime. So Canada becomes the hub, a transnational hub of amnesty activism. But because men can't go back to the United States, actually their female partners go down on their behalf. And so they play a really important lobbying role. They write press releases, they hold press conferences, but it's the women doing that work because they are able to travel more freely across the border. And because of the density of the population in Southern Ontario, they're able to travel to New York and to Boston and to these Washington, these centers of political power in a way that men actually couldn't do.
Sure. Okay. Interesting. And Allauren.
So some of so I work in Western Europe, so mostly England and France, but so there are important regional differences in some ways. So Estelle, for example, points out that in France, like the way that they have the kind of attitudes they have about queens were very different from the attitudes that they had about queens in England, and she uses this to make a point about absurdity, like if women are always supposed to be below men, then like you'd have a queen here in England bowing to her footmen or some line like that. So there are some important regional differences, but a lot of them are based in sort of a Christian metaphysics, which they share, because even though there are Protestants and Catholics, they share certain like core commitments in the Bible. So a lot of things are very importantly similar. But even though I focus mostly on Western Europe, there were women doing philosophy in this time period elsewhere in a different religious tradition. So there's a Korean Neo-Confucian philosopher, Im Yoonji-daeng, writing in the 18th century. And so she has a different like religious tradition, but she is very clearly doing the same kind of feminist work, but flavor of it is totally different in kind from Estelle or any of these other folks that I've been talking about, because there's a different cultural sort of milieu.
And I'm just curious, do you know if they were maybe not even in contact personally, but did they know of each other's work at all?
So
This woman in Korea and the Europeans? No.
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think she was pretty isolated, but she was contemporaneous.
Right. Fascinating. Okay, I think we have time maybe for one more question, and I'm going to come back to friendship because that was such a sort of, I think, core element in the feminism that we've been talking about this evening. So, and here's the question from one of our listeners. Friendship as a political tool and collective action are quite central here in our conversation tonight. Is collective digital action applicable here? Thinking about GoFundMe's, digital petitions, these sorts of tools that are common today, and can we make a linkage there? Lara, do you want to start?
Well, I can't help but think of Me Too, this quintessential sort of online social movement that actually transformed the kind of conversations we were having about sexual violence and sexual harassment. And I don't think the landscape looks the same. And so yeah, there's an example of, a lot of times people were brushing off that kind of digital activism, hashtagivism, however you say that. But there is an example of something that was incredibly powerful, and you could see network building happening as it was playing out on our screens.
Yep, exactly. Allauren, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think that's completely right. I think we've gotten lots of examples of this, both through, as this person mentions, GoFundMe's and digital petitions of various kinds, but also like the list of media men that went around the same time as Me Too. There are lots of ways in which people are pulling together, and that digital action is going to be really important, especially because we're all sort of increasingly socially isolated. It seems like this is a good way to get people on board emotionally and practically, so that you can leverage that into something in real life, like doing a protest, various kinds of collective action in the real world. I think absolutely. I think yeah, very, very important.
Yep. As you said at the very beginning, Allauren, you've got to find your people, right?
Yeah.
So, and if sometimes it's online, that works too. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up there. We're pretty much at the top of the hour. I just want to thank both Allauren and Lara for their time with us. It was fascinating to hear about their research. This is always an event I look forward to every year because I get to learn a little bit more about what my colleagues are working on. And I also want to thank everybody for coming out and listening. And I hope everybody will share their thoughts in our survey, which will be coming to you in your inbox following the seminar. The Alumni Engagement Office and the Faculty of Humanities has lots of events like this with other faculty members and alumni. So be sure to check your website. Be sure to give us your feedback on the survey, and please come out and join us another night. So thank you and have a great night, everyone. Bye-bye.